other issues associated with coronavirus started to hit. And as campaigning organisations, and obviously we work primarily on debt. We came together with about 200 other civil society organisations. We put out a joint statement and campaign for debt cancellation. And there was a global petition with about 750,000 people, which I'm sure lots of people on this call probably took part in that as well, signed to show that we were calling for debt cancellation. So, and what we were really asking for was debt cancellation for both 2020 and 2021, particularly for the kind of group of sort of 76 kind of lower income countries. And then an announcement was made towards the end of April of 12 billion worth of debt suspension, which is really good. We were kind of, that was obviously positive that came out, but it's clearly not enough. And I guess, for example, just the debts owed in 2020 total more than 40 billion, for example. That's sort of in dollars. So, and obviously it was a suspension rather than a cancellation. So I guess one of our main concerns is that if the debt is suspended, what you're going to see is that just rolling over into future years. So we're going to reach a point 2021, 2022, where you're actually just going to have this big balloon of debt. And then obviously the kind of the issue around dealing with the impacts of coronavirus, it's really just starting. Well, it is kind of, moving through different countries in the global south, and particularly kind of South and Central America at the moment, kind of lots of countries there. I think we're seeing the numbers go up and it become more of a crisis, but I guess it's still an unfolding. It's, here we're sort of coming out of lockdown a little bit. There's sort of tends to be lots of things are changing in other countries in Europe, but it's, the story is really still playing out in lots of different places around the world. So, so we need kind of action to make sure governments can respond to that properly, or, as much as they can. So, yeah, that's I guess the situation that we're in at the moment. What's sort of happening next is I probably should have said at the beginning, but there's kind of three main sorts of debt. So you've got debt owed to multinational lenders, so that's sort of the IMF and the World Bank. You've got debt owed between countries, so when one country lends to another country, and then you've got debt that is from private lenders. And it's roughly, I think, sort of a third for those. So about a third of that debt to private lenders is debt that countries owe to kind of banks and hedge funds. And there's obviously like a huge lack of transparency. So a lot of the time it's actually quite hard to tell how and where this money is moving. But I think the kind of key fact about that private debt is that a lot of it is actually adjudicated, or a lot of the legal kind of the legal sort of agreements around it are adjudicated through UK courts, about sort of 90% of it. So actually in the UK we have quite a big role to play in ensuring that debt is kind of dealt with in a transparent manner. So what we're trying to do at the moment is make sure that if a country does default on its payment, they won't get sued through UK courts. So we're trying. So if if a country feels that they would need to actually furnish their healthcare rather than service their debt right now to private lenders, that they won't automatically, they can't be sort of dragged through our courts by a hedge fund, for example. That's the sort of going to be the next focus for this sort of next bit of campaigning. And we're also going to look to there's another couple of big meetings coming up. So there's a G7 meeting, which is sort of 7 of the world's most powerful countries, And then there's a G20 finance ministers meeting, which is in late July, which is, I think, sort of 18th and 19th of July. And that's another moment where we might be able to see some more debt suspension or debt cancellation. So we're going to be, I guess, sort of campaigning and pushing towards those moments. And I think the other thing just to add as well is that when we heard that first announcement, when that first came out, we have heard from a lot of sources that, we think there's potential to do more, or we think if we, if there was pressure, then we could get more could happen. So I think we're not, it's not necessarily a case of like, okay, they've done a thing and now they're not going to do anything else. There's, I think, potential to maybe get quite a lot more progress and kind of get some debt cancellation, which is really needed in general, but particularly in this year. So I think I might stop there. That was a little bit of a whistle stop. So, so I'm happy to like go over any of that. I know there was quite a few different things in there.
Thank you very much indeed. That's given us quite a lot to chew on. Have I got the microphone back, John? That's given us quite a lot to chew on, I think. And the question of our old friends, the vulture funds, it seems to me that this is a word we may be coming to revisit. I think this is quite significant for us in Greater Manchester because the Vulture Fund Bill 2010, which crept through on the wash-up at the end of the Brown government, was in fact piloted largely by our local MP, Andrew Gwynn. Thank you very much for that. I had a couple of useful questions there about which maybe you can think about. One of them from Sandra: what's the money and why can't societies make it do what is needed for good of all and not just for a chosen few? She's had the same problem I do, which is this machine has a mind of its own. In ways that same environment and cease inequalities. And then another one, can the UK government prevent creditors taking action in UK courts against debtors' national governments? I mean, is it a question of moral suasion in the short term and embarrassment, embarrassing hedge funds, embarrassing banks, or is there something we can actually do legally? But maybe we'll come back to you on that. And let's go across now, please, to Dottie. Dottie, can you tell us more thoughts as to the implications for all this? Because I think we can see some of these factors are coming forward. There was all this pressure for the hashtag that we talked about. Drop debt, save lives. But maybe it's a little bit more complicated than that. Mm-hmm. Over to Dottie.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. Well, my surname is pronounced Guerrero. It's a Spanish surname, actually. It shows that our colonial past. It's a Spanish term, means warrior. So I'm pretty proud of my name because of what it means. And one of the things, precondition when I married my husband, he's British, I said, I'm gonna use my name Guerrero because that's me. And he said, can I use your name instead? Anyway, well, there would be some interlap with what what Eva mentioned, also because of some questions I'm seeing in the chat. But I think generally we can say that well, health-wise, although there are still so many factors that are still unknown about the pandemic, but what we could already determine is that the economic impacts would be immense. I remember in the first, in some webinars that I have seen, you have both mainstream economists and heterodox economists, or those economists who are more not just wedded on mainstream thinking, are united in the conclusion that this pandemic has a lot is trailing a different path, because if we would look at the past crisis, and since you've already mentioned, I'm old enough already to have experienced the three huge economic crises in my already organized life. I was still living in the Philippines when the 1998 crisis happened. And I think what I wanted to say as well is, during crisis, the battle actually is about analyzing or interpreting it. What will be the prevalent narratives and interpretation of that crisis, because that is where the alternatives will come in. So whatever prevalent analysis of the causes, and therefore what should be the solutions, is also a battle of idea. And that's why it is very, very important that discussions like this, that there are alternatives that are being built at the moment, because the question of what kind of world we wanted to see and live in after this pandemic will depend on the kind of levers that we will use at the moment, the kind of movement building, the kind of demands that we will put forward. So in 1998, I remember the first financial crisis is quite small compared to the one that we are facing in the future. And at that time, what became the debate that became widely talked about is that it is an Asian capitalist crisis, which for us was laughable. There's no such a thing as Asian capitalism. It's all capitalism. The difference is, of course, many of the experiments are done first in the developing South. And so the austerity that the Europeans have experienced were done first in the developing countries. So the question then of it's a crisis that came from Asia because of the particular way that capitalism is being done there was the debate. And jumping on 2008 crisis, it originated in the developed world at that time, the US and the UK economies. And the US responded by saying, be patriotic, shop, to get ourselves out of the crisis. While majority of the European countries, the governments opted for austerity measures, that to resolve the crisis, then we have to cut back on services, cut back on funds to all these basic needs of people, and be thrifty. While at the same time, for us in Asia, China did the reverse. It rolled out the biggest stimulus package known in peacetime. And without that stimulus package, the rest of Asia would have fallen to the crisis at that time. So actually, the response of China saved Asia in terms of saving the economies of Asia, because at that time, it is more now. At that time, most of the global chain of production in that region are already divided between Japan and China in terms of manufacturing everything. The materials and a different stage of production are in the smaller economies like Southeast Asia, Vietnam, the Philippines, Indonesia. Had the Chinese government not rolled out the stimulus package, then the crisis of 2008 would have been worst. But this time, the crisis started in China, so it is the epicenter, both of the health crisis. But what is interesting to see is how fast the Chinese economy seems to be recovering, because they were able to act fast as well on the crisis. They were able to prevent it from spreading to the cities, and the measures that were put in place would be quite harsh, but at the same time they prevented the spread. So I mentioned this because I wanted to lay out that in terms of reaction and making sense of the crisis, it is important to see not just the economic, but also the social and the implications globally, to approach it with an internationalist perspective as well, because it is like this time we're facing a global pandemic, so therefore the which is bigger than with an economic impact that is bigger than the Great Depression event of the Second World War, or the last World War. So what we're expecting, the WTO is saying that between 13 and 32%, all the trade will fall between 13 and 32% over 2020. If lockdown, that is if, big if the lockdown is lifted in early summer, if there will be a second wave, then it will be beyond that figure, it will be bigger than that figure. So also, if as Eva mentioned, the exports of goods was extremely affected, and that other than those that are deemed essential, all manufacturing, all production have effectively ceased. Travel has declined as well, and there are still planes flying, but reduced to a tiny fraction of what it was, and tourism has stopped almost 100% for the time being. The International Monetary Fund also predicted in mid-April, I think around April 14 or 16, they are already saying that the global output will fall by 3% for 2020 as well. And in terms of per capita, it could be 4.5% as well. So in terms of the impact of the global economy, it already looks severe. The disruption of supply chain, the devastation of in terms of physical infrastructure as well, or the health service as well, and that is still in the north. The restriction of mobility, the restriction of economic activity is more severe in the south. If it is already unprecedented in the developed countries, then let's imagine as well how the near cessation of economic activity in the south will impact the south. I am doing a series of interviews with representatives of social movements, so you can also look at that in the Global Justice Now website. And so far, I have interviews from Bangladesh, South Africa, South Korea, and Ecuador. There will be more coming. There will be Brazil, the Philippines, China, Russia also in the near future. We're just uploading all of them. What I see as another trend in the South is that apart from it being a perfect storm economically, in terms of collapsing trade, the impact also of work migration, because a lot of people, workers from the South as well, are coming back to their countries. Those that are working in Europe, for example, those who are working in Spain, Portugal, Italy, many of migrant workers from Latin America need to come back to their countries because there's no work available in those countries, and many of them became unemployed. In the rest of the world, like the economic problem in Japan will have a domino effect for migrant workers from Asia, and the impact of that will be, apart from the lack of manufacturing economic activities, what they have lost as well for the loss of work for migrant worker is the remittances. And there were already arguments before that if we would look at the remittances of migrant workers to their home countries, it could actually rival the global trade. Because many countries, like the Philippines, for example, about the assessment of many independent economists are saying that about 14% of foreign currency are actually from remittances. In the UK alone, there's 21,000 nurses and healthcare workers from the Philippines. So if there will be a crisis here wherein the care workers, or if they will get sick and will not be able to work or die, then the domino effect on their families and the economy will be severe as well, because that would mean the end of their remittances. The third factor that I will say is on security issues, because in many countries in South Africa, in the Philippines, there's a heightened degree, Kenya as well, there's a heightened degree of militarization because the government is approaching the crisis in a way where it's similar to a martial law or similar to a condition where you have curfews. I happened to grow up during the time of dictatorship in the Philippines. I have experienced how it is to have martial law, where if you're out at, out of the certain hours that you're supposed to be outside your house, you can be arrested. And that is already happening in the Philippines and in Ecuador, where people who are caught outside their house were put in jail, and in a very cramped jail. You're talking of a small cell with more than 100 people, which is actually defeating the purpose of social distancing, because you're putting healthy people that you caught who are trying to eke out a living, and you put them in jail. And that and then a connected issue there is that in countries like in Bangladesh, for example, with the start of the pandemic, 100 million workers, mostly female, who are in garment manufacturing, have lost their jobs, and some of them even defied the lockdown to be able to save their jobs. So the question of how will you talk about lockdown and social distancing in a situation like that? Another thing that I would like to say as well is that in looking at this, we have to look at how people are affected differently as well, not just in the South, but also here in the North. How are the different sectors affected differently with workers, both the informal and formal workers, and how do we build back? How do we build back better as well? There's now a campaign on that. I saw that there's a question on why can't country just manufacture money. Unfortunately, it's only the US that have that privilege, because the world's reserve currency is the US dollar. So they can prop up their economy just by monetizing and printing. But if you look at how countries are also addressing, this is one key learning, that now planning should be back in the agenda. That in the past 3 decades, all the governments were told we should be more, we should ease the control in the economic policies. But then now with this pandemic, it is more important to have long-term and short-term planning. So that would mean a bigger role for states, a bigger role for government to control the economy. And I think, do I still have time? In this aspect, we could see the big difference also with how the developed countries are reacting. Like Germany have put almost 5% of their GDP into a sort of stimulus package. Japan have put 20% of their GDP. And if you compare that, I think the UK is putting 4%, if I'm not mistaken, of the GDP in terms of addressing the crisis. So how much money will the government put to ensure that not just the corporations will be propped up, but more importantly, how much will the workers be supported? So we're talking of furloughing until August, and then maybe a review on how much workers will continue to have salaries. And we're not yet talking about the informal workers or those who are in the gig economy. So in terms of this seismic shock and the magnitude of the crisis across the world, what is also quite likely is that we could not pick up where we left. So it's impossible to talk of going back to the normal, because first and foremost, that normal is problematic. That normal for many countries in the South means death, because that would mean more extractivism, more mining. Actually, now in link with the militarization and heightened police role, many governments are actually taking advantage of COVID-19 to pursue things that they will be opposed before. In Brazil, in South Africa, in the Philippines, in Ecuador, mining hasn't stopped. In fact, some governments are interpreting that mining is actually essential because of their fear that if you stop coal mining, in South Africa, coal is an essential commodity, so they will not close the coal mines even during the pandemic. And in fact, they will force people to continue working, whether they're sick or not, to continue working in the mines because energy is important, and more than 80% of South Africa depends on coal on coal for their energy. So this is another factor that would heighten the conflict, because while people could not organize and oppose the entrance of transnational corporations in their territory, there would be a lot of grabbing, resource grabbing. There will be a continuation of more destructive activities of transnational corporations that people will not be able to oppose the way they're opposing them before. So again, in our campaign, how do we ensure that apart from thinking of economic and health issue, the issue of democracy and end of militarization, or how to address this issue of militarization? I want to wrap up now, also by saying that at this point, before the COVID-19, we are talking about the climate emergency, that we actually have maybe less than a decade before we hit 1.5 degrees of average global warming. And that is not just a figure, because many countries in the global south are already reeling from the impacts of the climate crisis. And that would mean as well the impact to livelihood. For example, if the 1.5 will be reached, then Africa will be toast. Many rice farmers will not be able to grow their rice and produce rice, because rice don't grow or don't produce beyond a certain warmth in the evening. So it is at this point where we have to we should not forget the climate emergency in the responses. And in fact, the 3 decades or 4 decades of climate mobilization or climate justice mobilization have actually produced a lot of alternatives. So a lot of systemic alternatives. They can be combined with our response to COVID-19. For example, how do we reorient the economy, especially the economy, not globally, but also globally, and also the economy of the South, which is oriented to exporting raw natural resources. How do we reorient our food systems? The craziness of the fact that most of our food here in the UK are from abroad. So how can we start talking about our own food security and food and reliance on ourselves to produce our own food? Because if it will be a problem of disruption of supply and disruption of distribution on the second wave, then it will be a huge problem. So I think I will end there, and then maybe more on how do we build a bigger we, how do we mobilize at this point, make sense, and build a new internationalism as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dottie. You've given us a wonderful lot to think about, including things that weren't on the front of my mind. Having said that, I had an email from a friend in Johannesburg in the last week talking about the realities of being locked down there. And, you know, he's
people there.
he lives a comfortable life, he's middle class, but that is a real live issue. That's something facing people, which we don't think about here. You know, people gripe about not being able to kick a football around in the park. You don't think about being attacked by armed thugs for going out. Just before we come back to some of those, there have been a couple of good questions in it. One little factual one. Could you just confirm, you talked about the range was 13 to 32%, I think, for turn down. What exactly? So can you just remind us exactly what that was you were thinking of? You need to unmute.
So the World Trade Organization is talking of between 13 to 32% of fall on trade by 2020. That is, if the lockdown is lifted globally in early summer. But the thing is, in some other in other countries, it's only starting. And also, if we're not talking here yet of a second wave, if there will be a second wave in Europe, then we might reach the extreme, which is 32 or even beyond. So 13 and 32%. And then the global output will fall by this is an April 14 figure by 3%, and as much as 4.5% in per capita terms.
Thank you very much.
That's the most optimistic. That's the most optimistic.
Thank you very much. And it struck me that maybe, as you talked about how people in the global south are hit more, I suppose this is largely because they actually have to go out and they tend to be doing more manual jobs, close together, heavier work. Whereas the option of working at home for many of them doesn't exist. They aren't likely, so many of them, to be spending their time with their wife sat in the front room on her laptop. Now, so I just can we just flick back to Eva? The question that Suzanne had raised in the global aftermath, the 2007-2008 financial crisis, there seemed to be a sense of remorse and we must do better in financial and political circles. This seemed to descend into business as usual and worst, austerity policy. Now we know that in the UK we had a change of government following on from that, and that may have affected it. But do the panelists, and here I'm saying from a Jubilee Debt Campaign perspective, have any real hope that building back better from the coronavirus crisis amongst governments, not just in the UK, but those that we aim to champion the cause for?
Yeah, it's quite a big question. I think, I guess I'll maybe start by talking about the debt side a bit. So we, as I said, sort of, one of the impacts has been this kind of huge resurgence in kind of debt, but also the issue is now kind of back on the agenda again for in quite a serious way than we've seen for a while. So I guess that is potentially somewhat of a positive thing in terms of the kind of understanding that this is a huge problem, and okay, if we have to cancel it because in this emergency situation, then we need to do something about it longer term. So and I think it sort of links to another question that someone's put in, that David's put in. So, what can we learn from the Jubilee 2000 campaign? I guess what we would say is, you need to tackle the underlying causes of the debt issue as well as kind of go for the debt cancellation. So the causes, things linked to the issue of debt itself would be, having a proper workout mechanism for countries for their debt, a kind of proper international mechanism for doing that that's just sort of set up. But also there's obviously all of the kind of underlying structural factors around, kind of tax dodging and unfair trade rules and the way that the global economy is set up. So really tackling those structures is what needs to happen. But I guess like a lot of people have said the same thing, sort of, what happened to the debt cancellation we did kind of 15 years ago? So like, I think there's a bit of an understanding that you have to tackle it in a more long-term way. So I think we can probably, we'll have some success, I think, potentially with like maybe pushing some of that messaging forward at this point. But I think, overall, I think it's, I think there's opportunities, but I think there's opportunities for it to go the other way as well. So almost some of the sort of disaster capitalism stuff that Dottie was referencing, you could see people taking advantage of this situation to, take land, to take space, to sort of claim that back. So but I do, I guess the stuff that sort of makes me feel positive in from, this conversations that, you know, we've heard in the UK anyway, of just, I guess, partly that thing of it's, oh, you know, there was a week where lots of stuff happened that was kind of like, isn't on these things that should just happen anyway. So, you know, the week where, you know, everyone who was homeless was put up in a hotel. And so I think that seeing those, and, you know, the kind of huge, the enormous kind of economic engineering of the furlough scheme, that sort of thing. So, you know, doing these big things, I think, shows what is possible and gives, you know, puts people in a slightly different mindset, I think. So that sort of thing, I think, there's things to build on, I think. And we're in a slightly different reality now. But yeah, I'm sure Dotty's got some thoughts on that as well.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I see that. I've been chasing my tail, following some of the tweets from your colleague Tim the last 24 hours, where I gather that there's a bit of an issue because although the G20 may have said they're encouraging a large number of countries to look for, I don't know, debt holidays or moratoriums, some of the countries are sluggish on taking them up because they think that it's going to build a problem further down the tracks. And I also found an article published today about the US signing a free trade agreement with Kenya, which also brought back the prospect of land grabs. And I wonder to what extent the old question of countries being scared of losing their creditworthiness and following, maybe not having to follow, but being emotionally coerced into following free trade deals, is something which we need to be aware of. That's a question for you, and maybe also Dotty might reflect on it. Unmute.
Sorry. I think actually I'll maybe let Dotty come in on the kind of trade aspects. I guess just on that dynamic of countries potentially not taking up or not kind of moving forward with the you know, the sort of debt suspension as it is now, because they're concerned about their kind of status in terms of what that means for future borrowing. I think it's so I think that's partly why I think the continuing to make the point around why the cancellation is needed and create that space for kind of, you know, create the noise and create the space for kind of countries to be able to take up those that suspension. But also it kind of speaks of, I guess, this sort of power of finance and power of the financial markets as well, and, you know, the kind of ratings agencies that kind of say how much, you know, we're all worth, and on the in terms of kind of country, you know, country worth and that sort of thing. So it's, I think it sort of speaks to me of the need to kind of really take on that power actually, and that power of global finance. And, you know, if where, you know, we've seen time and time again when sort of countries get put in these straits, but it's, you know, we've got to sort of keep, I guess, pushing and keep kind of shining a light on that. Sorry, not to use, I know that's an overused phrase, but yeah.
Thank you very much indeed. We better get our torches wound up. Dotty, could you contribute?
Yeah, I wanted to talk first on the economy as well, and then on the trade and ISDS issues, because well, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was that it is actually an exorbitant privilege from developed countries that they have some savings, or they have the capacity to address the economic needs, to prop up the economy at this time of crisis. Many developed countries do not have that. So if they talk about the need, for example, to give relief or food parcels to people that have lost jobs, many of the countries are now asking for loans to be able to do that. There is a news I've read in the Philippines that the government is asking for loans from China to be able to address the economic consequences of the crisis. And many countries will do that. That's why they might end up more indebted, because the way they could address this crisis and prop up the economy is through borrowing more. In terms of the question on trade, why do countries agree on trade? Well, it's historically, because it is one of the debates before in the way that the economy of the South is in the whole global economy is oriented, that governments would feel that if they don't sign on trade agreements, they will be left behind. They will not be. They wanted to be part of that. It's like being on the bus. You'll be left behind if you don't agree to trade agreements. But the problem is that trade agreements are not actually just trade agreements. Most of them are instrument to facilitate investments. And then I think from previous discussions on various Global Justice Now discussions on the ISDS, some of the things, for example, that are being done now will not be possible if the more country will be signing up to trade agreements with ISDS. For example, the way that Spain appropriated some public hospitals for use during the pandemic, because they're running out of beds in the public hospitals, so they appropriated, or they use some of the private hospitals for COVID patients. With ISDS, they will be sued by companies if those hospitals or services are owned by foreign investments. Before COVID, the big question is that the big problem was that you have countries that, in pursuant to their climate commitments, they were closing some of, or they're close, like Indonesia, for example, wanted to restrict palm oil or restricting some economic activities of transnational corporations because of the environmental damages, and they are sued. More and more big business, more and more transnational corporations are actually using trade agreements to earn more by suing instead of actually doing business, which is ridiculous. And we foresee that there are new papers coming out that with many of the negotiations going on with UK-US trade agreement, for example, it will be more difficult for us to, for example, to talk about manufacturing the vaccine or medicines on our own, because that will be part of the NHS, and many functions of the NHS are part of the trade deal with the US. So the big question, why are we signing to this? Why are we in a rush even that during the pandemic, we wanted to push with this crazy trade agreement with the US? So that's a big question. And with other countries, CETA, the CETA negotiation, or that's the more European negotiation also restarted, and it's being debated in the Dutch Parliament today, starting today. And many of the trade campaigners are saying that at this point in time where we need to save lives, signing into these trade agreements that will lock our hands into thinking more of how government can plan more and more efficiently and with more flexibility is simply crazy. Because at this point, there are measures that government must do which are unthinkable before. Like even what the UK government is doing now, with putting more money and well, planning might be a question because they have a way of planning. It's more like touch and go. If people are questioning some policies, then they will retract, although without admitting that they are wrong, the next few days. So the flexibility for countries to plan their economy will be taken away from them with ISDS, and that's why we are campaigning against the ISDS as well.
Thank you very much indeed for that. It's given us a fair bit to chew on. As ever, I think it's one of these conversations that starts spiraling off like they're knitting. Question winding back a bit. David Mayers has asked a question: what's the alternative to debt cancellation? Why was the 2000 campaign successful? What can we learn from it? Eva.
Okey-doke. Yeah, I'll try and answer this as best I can, because I wasn't. I was slightly involved, but like, but not. Yeah. So I think so. That was obviously a campaign that sort of developed over a number of years. So I think I think probably one of the key things is just that kind of need to keep building up and keep going at it. I think the kind of coalition of different allies was kind of very important. So there was a lot of sort of faith-based organisations involved. There was, there's a huge network of organisations kind of around the world that were, part of this coalition, kind of building up towards the kind of the sort of G8 meeting that where a lot of the announcements around HIPC were made. I think also, as with most campaigns as well, almost a bit of not a bit of luck exactly, but kind of a bit of being in the right place at the right time and using the kind of political leverage that existed at that point to be able to move the campaign forward. But I think there's lots and lots to be learned, but I think in some ways one of the things that's a bit tricky is we're almost slightly a victim of our own success, because there was I think you may now that we've had a bit more kind of recognition recently with the situation with COVID, it might change, but I think for a while we were sort of hearing quite a lot of, wasn't that dealt with, and it's actually no. It kind of, HIPC was a useful initiative and has done quite a lot, but there, debt, even before COVID, and I was describing at the beginning, debt is still a huge issue for lots of countries.
Thank you very much. And following on from that, one from Ricky, who I remember meeting years and years ago, the Christian Aid meeting, which I think may have been about debt, was the 2000 debt was described as unpayable. That was potent argument in favour of cancellation. Our country is still described as HIPC, and is their debt genuinely unpayable? Has it ever really gone away, or has it just been forgotten about?
Yeah. So HIPC, I think, as an initiative is still going. So that's the sort of heavily indebted poor countries initiative. And actually, I think it was Somalia actually had some debt cancelled under HIPC sort of fairly recently, within the last few months of the last year or something like that. What makes it unpayable, it comes to light in situations where we are now, where the interest rates go through the roof and it becomes this huge burden. But yes, I would say a lot of this debt is unpayable, and also I think you have to look at where the debt comes from as well, and where debt is described as unfair or odious, or as in the case of Mozambique was a huge amount of it was taken out illegally from a private lender without it going through Parliament. So a lot of this debt has been incurred unfairly and sometimes illegally.
Thank you very much indeed. I was just typing an answer to someone else. The other question I'd say is, there's one that Pia asked some time ago. Why do British courts play such a big role in adjudicating? And then she says, e.g. German, American or Chinese private loans.
Yes, sure. I was thinking we should go back to some of those that came in earlier. So it's actually it was the sort of private loans specifically that I was talking about, so with sort of banks and hedge funds, and essentially it's just a kind of result of the development of kind of global financial systems. So the other place where a lot of it where a lot of it is adjudicated is in New York. And basically it's just because these are the big financial centers. So if it's banks or hedge funds kind of making those loans, then those are the legal systems they're using.
Thank you very much. Dottie, do you have a contribution on that?
Well, I wanted to go back not on this question, but also on why many of the debts are unpayable. And actually, there's also I want to add on that some of the debts should not be paid in the first place, because one, especially if they're odious, and you have mentioned from the beginning, my entry into collective action is during the time of the dictatorship in the Philippines, having a dictatorship regime where you have no way to question any project, and a government can just borrow left and right. One of the projects that I got involved in at the beginning was a nuclear power plant in Luzon, in Bataan. And it was a loan to the World Bank. And well, there are several problems. One, the nuclear power plant in the first place was opposed by people, but the government wanted it. And second, it was placed on an area with an earthquake fault. So who in the right mind will put a nuclear power plant on an earthquake fault? And when the change of government happened in 1986, so the debt was started in the 1980s. The whole plant was finished in 1984. With the change of government, that was mothballed. It wasn't used at all, but the Filipino people are still paying for that debt, and we will still pay that until 2025. So many debts like that owed by the developing countries are questionable, and at the same time, the interest rate or the money being put annually actually have more than paid for what was owed. And in the impact to the economy, you have 2 or 3 generations that have lost what is called in the debt campaign as the lost generation, because developing countries need to pay that debt in exchange of cutting down on their basic services, and at the same time just exporting raw materials and to be able to earn the currency to be able to pay the debts.
Thank you very much indeed. That's been very helpful, I think. Now, I've had one question which I think is about tax justice, and I responded to that saying I'll deal with that maybe at something for a different conversation, rather than get tied up with that. But I think there's a very good fundamental question here from David. So in simple terms, will there be a trade-off between debt relief and free trade deals, including ISDS? And this may not be something which is done structurally, but as you said, Dottie, I think it's the sort of the ambience, the world view which is pushed out, determines the answers that people come up with. Dottie, would you like to go first on that?
Yeah, well, the thing is, debt relief is not even in the discussion when countries are discussing new trade agreements or the ISDS. It is ISDS is put as an investment provision, and that as I mentioned earlier, it's a way to facilitate investment and give power to corporations. So what is sad here is that at this point the corporations are already very, very powerful. In many of my talks, I called transnational corporations as a new empire. They can go anywhere, anytime, do anything with very little power from governments to stop them. And with the ISDS, that will increase their power. So I so far, many of the countries that are negotiating a free trade agreement, if that will be a carrot, that will also that will impact more on the economy, because a debt relief is just like kicking the can down the road. It's different from dropping the debt, which is what must be done. In terms of how poor countries are still are saying that they are looking at trillions of dollars that will be needed to pay the debt just this year. And with COVID-19, it is simply not just immoral, but it, politically wrong to pressure developing countries to pay their debt at this point when they can't even address the basic question of survival of their population.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And Eva?
I don't think I've actually got much more to add on that. So.
Okay, fair dues. Now,
I think you're muted. You're muted.
You're muted, Stephen.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Sorry, a previous occasion I had a lot of feedback, so I'm getting obsessive about muting myself. Part of the subtext of this evening's event is for us to think about things that we can actually be doing during the lockdown. Here in Manchester, years ago, the Global Justice Group and the Jubilee Debt Group used to be coterminous, and we split up when Global Justice moved off into its new dispensation a few years ago. But many people, I suspect, like I have, will be able to change T-shirt. And I did this a few minutes ago. At the moment, whilst our leader in the Global Justice Group, Manchester, is under the weather, I've been coordinating things at this end, and we would encourage anybody locally to get in touch with us to build our capacity so we can do things together. But I'd like now to introduce Prue Cahill, who John, I hope, will bring in on her screen. Prue, please unmute yourself and switch your camera on. And Prue is the contact person, the lead person for Jubilee Debt Campaign in Manchester currently. Prue, I see your microphone's on. I don't see your face. If you want to be anonymous, that's okay. Here we are.
I don't know how to do that. I can't see the button for turning the camera on. But can you hear me? You can hear
yes,
me. Okay.
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. So I'm part of Jubilee Debt Campaign in Manchester, along with Stephen. I'm a Methodist minister in the city centre, so I've got a lot on, a lot of different hats. But we're part of that group, and we have been part of campaigning the last two November. We found a Saturday, the last two Novembers, and had a stall and interacted with people. I don't think you can see me, but we've, you remember the postcards of the 1980s and 1990s. So we've had some of these End the Debt Trap, which have been a good thing to hand out. So we've been kind of ad hoc, but we do have our own page on the website, which I'll. Oh, here we go. I'm added as a panelist. So let me just start the video, and then you can see me because I have put my scarf on from Cologne all those years ago. So really what I just said, we're just a few of us. We'd like to have more. We a campaigning group, ad hoc really, but we have had a couple of events the last 2 years, and it'd be great to welcome anyone else who wants to be part of this. I think the question for me is always, what can we do? And if I'm taking this back to the people in my church, the question would be, what can we do? And I think postcard sending or petitioning, or even just being aware of the issues and writing to our MP, or being prepared to ask a question, Stephen, on any questions the other night, things like that, just to raise the awareness of debt. Household debt people understand, don't they? And hopefully are reminded of those campaigns of the 1990s. So I'll put the link on the chat in a minute.
Thank you very much indeed, Prue. Thank you very much indeed. Like I say, there's lots we can do. We've got a Facebook page. We've got we've got a little micro website. Basically, if you want to keep up to date, look at the Facebook page, and we're open to working with other people. Now, what I'd also say now at this point, could please I ask Eva and then Dottie to tell us what they, speaking from the NGO point of view, would like us to be getting up to here and now whilst we're in lockdown. What can we be doing here in Manchester? Eva.
So I think, just as I was mentioning at the sort of end of the first bit, the next big thing is really going to be having a push on getting a bit of legislation so that countries can't be sued if they end up defaulting on their debts for private lenders. And we're looking to get that in get an amendment in the insolvency bill, which is about to start sort of going through Parliament. So sort of contacting MPs, that sort of thing is very useful on that front. And I can send you some drafts, the sort of briefing and a kind of draft letter, that sort of thing. But that I think is something that people can do from home, and kind of online and stuff as well. I'd say as much as possible, I think just that, you know, I was just sort of question what's the timescale of action. So we're waiting for it to come in to Parliament, and then we're going to basically do a big push and kind of contact everyone. So that'll go quite quickly when it comes. I guess the next kind of big moment, so I was saying, are kind of really sort of building up pressure towards that G20 finance ministers meeting in July, towards the end of July. And that's, sort of building up numbers on the petitions, kind of doing other actions, that sort of thing. But I'd say, I guess as a general thing, it feels like it is obviously a bit harder to kind of mobilize and kind of meet and do sort of protests whilst we're in lockdown. But I think what has been quite interesting is the number of kind of different networks and groups that have sort of sprung up, and kind of local sort of community groups, that sort of thing online, which I'm sure people have become part of and become active in. So I'd say sort of even kind of looking around at sort of where it's appropriate to maybe sort of bring the campaigning and talk about the campaign, and see if you're able to kind of build kind of solidarity and build numbers through those new community networks, just as a kind of a COVID specific thing.
Thank you very much indeed. I'd say that from when I've met South Manchester MPs, and I don't include the MP for Central and I don't include North Manchester, but the MPs for South Manchester and Kate Green have been very sympathetic to the Jubilee cause. Some of them have personal experience and have campaigned with it in the past. So starting to raise it, even informally, in their consciousness, I think is no bad idea. Thank you very much indeed. And please do keep us posted with that. And as soon as you do, I'll send it out on our Facebook, Jubilee Debt Campaign Facebook page, and we'll probably be disseminating it to people who've signed up for this event. Dottie, would you like to contribute with what you'd like us to be getting up to here and now?
Yeah. I think we're together with the Jubilee Debt on the signature campaign to drop the debt and save lives. But also make the COVID vaccine accessible to all is one big campaign that we're doing, and that's in our Parma campaign. It's also in the website. It's another signature campaign to make the vaccine accessible for all. But I think it's not yet on the level of campaign. But one of the ideas that I think was driven to everyone is that this pandemic has brought about a change in attitudes to public health. So how do we defend the NHS? How do we make sure that in trade agreements it will not be put in the negotiation table? That's the threat of the UK-US FTA, that the NHS will be one of the important or key aspect of the negotiation, and we have to prevent that. And that the decades of neoliberal policy privatizing many of the services of the NHS must really stop. And then third, I think at this point as well on the issue of migration, because we have seen that the way that the migrants are being treated here have shown also during the pandemic that many of the workers that are essential are migrant workers. The fact that those that are working in NHS are also being charged a health surcharge. They're paying double. So that's it's not our campaign, but I think these are the practical or sensible things to do. If it's an essential service, it should not be illegal. They should be regularized. That's not just NHS, but also delivery, food. Those in our food service system, if many of them are migrant services or services held by migrants. A last one, in the building up or when we get out of this, or even at this point, many of the big businesses are getting dole outs or getting, I use the word dole out because that's what it is. They're getting help from public money. So all those support that they get from the government we should leverage is in a way that they should change the way they function, the way that the way they run the business. So it should be businesses or especially large corporations should reorient the way they do their business. So there should be more regulation. So in the recovery strategy, that should be part of the requirement that it should not be for business but also for employees. There should be more demands for more environmental or climate oriented policies in their business practices.
Thank you very much indeed. It strikes me most of those are things that people can pick up on the website, just going straight to Global Justice UK, org UK. And maybe a key thing to do, because I know that sometimes a lot of actions come out which aren't on the website, is to sign up for activist emails. And that'll be the same also for Jubilee Debt Campaign, because that way you can really put your shoulder to the wheel and get something done every day, I know. Thank you very much indeed. Now, before we finish up, and thank you everybody for contributing to this, I've got a checklist which I better check that I've dealt with a number of things. But one of the key things we want to do locally, to celebrate this or to build something out of it, is we're asking people to reflect on something which has come to you this evening. If you use social media, please use social media. If you don't, you could email your reflection just to either me, Stephen Pennells, Stephen_Pennells at yahoo.co.uk, or to the Global Justice Manchester email address, which you've had. And we would ask you to put in something that maybe, as a teacher, I used to say, we give you a starter. You don't have to use it, you can use something else. Here's a starter. Many countries are tied up in debt, and we should, or we could, do something to address the issue. Or, coming out of the coronavirus crisis, we should. Or, I'm a Mancunian, or wherever you come from, I'm concerned about the Trump trade deal because of the threat too. Or something else. We'd ask you to either do a little video clip or send us a bit of text through an email or send us a picture, something creative, something that we can put together to make into a response that we can share on this. We'll try and do this fairly quickly, and then we will send it back to people. We'll publish it. If you want to be anonymous, just say you want to be anonymous. If you don't do video and you could like send us a picture of yourself, just do that as well. If you don't want to do that, we'll find a picture that will fit with it. And just before we get on with that, the last question that's popped up, which it strikes me as a great one, which we can reflect on. And I'm saying this because I'm thinking about the fact that I had an email from Christian Aid this afternoon talking about the success of their campaign last year with HSBC. Here's a question. Are any banks that were bailed out in 2008 likely to be asked to cancel debts for developing countries? If so, that's the sort of topic which you could actually get up to. You could go and pop a letter through their letterbox. Or you could just tweet them or email them. Maybe that's a question. Eva, do you happen to have any knowledge on that one?
I don't know specifically, I'm afraid. I think one of the things, I think it is a really good question. I think one of the things is, as ever, the kind of lack of transparency with these things. So there's a lot where we don't actually know where the money is owed, but I will endeavour to find out.
Thank you very much indeed. If you send it back to us, we'll send it on to David, and maybe we'll publish it. That'd be a great thing to do. And Dottie, do you have any thought on that?
Well, they just became bigger after 2008.
Indeed, they became bigger. But one of the things that I find quite amazing is that sometimes, although some things, some banks only exist in London, other institutions which I read about around the world actually have headquarters in Manchester as well. There's an insurance company, insurance brokers, that are tied up with trying to find insurance for the Adani, is it Adani mine in Australia? There was an online action last night. And lo and behold, they have an office in Manchester City Centre where we can go and do a little bit of chalking on the pavement or something. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for that. I think we more or less reached our logging off time. What I suggest we do is, please, everybody, remember that request. I'll pop into the chat the starters I had, if I can find them and cut and paste them. And then what I suggest we do is we can all switch our videos on, and if you want to remain anonymous, you can not do that. But if you can all unmute, then we can show our appreciation in the usual way. Thank you very much indeed.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just pop that text in the chat. Panelists, don't feel you've got to stay here all evening whilst I try and pick up the bits. And we're going to switch off the recording in a tick. But I'll leave the chat on for a second.
Cool. Thanks very much, Stephen.
Okay, pleasure.
Sharing.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is
I
this
hope that
I've been involved with. Global Justice or Tax Justice Network.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
you.
Hello,
Thanks a lot.
it's me.